George Mitchell's hands had stopped shaking 3 years ago, the day they lowered his wife into the ground. Since then, retirement had been a slow fade into routine. Coffee at dawn, crossword puzzles, evening walks where the only sound was his own breathing. At 60 years old, with 35 years on the rails behind him, he had earned his peace. The Montana mountains stretched beyond his window, permanent and indifferent, much like the quiet life he had built. But peace, George would learn, was never guaranteed. The phone call came at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had been unremarkable until that moment. The voice on the other end belonged to Tommy Chen, a dispatcher George had trained years ago. The words came fast, tangled with panic. A passenger train, the Northern Star, was heading south from Glacier National Park with 187 people aboard. The switching mechanism at Devil's Bend had malfunctioned, locked in the wrong position. If no one intervened, the train would take the eastern track, a route that ended at a collapsed bridge over a 200-foot ravine. The young engineers on site were paralyzed, unable to diagnose the problem, unable to act. They needed someone who understood the old systems, someone who had seen every failure the rails could offer. George felt something cold settle in his chest. Devil's Bend. He knew that switch like he knew his own heartbeat. He'd maintained it for 15 years, back when the infrastructure was newer and the safety protocols were tighter. But that was before budget cuts, before automation, before the railroad company decided experience was more expensive than technology. His arthritic fingers closed around the phone, and he asked the only question that mattered: how much time? Tommy's answer was a knife. 43 minutes until impact. George grabbed his coat and keys, his mind already racing through schematics and solutions. His daughter Sarah's voice echoed in his memory from their last call. "Dad, you've done enough. Rest. Enjoy your retirement." But there were 187 people on that train who didn't care about his retirement. They cared about living through the next hour. His knees protested as he ran to his truck, a dull ache that had become his constant companion. His hands, twisted with arthritis, fumbled with the ignition. Doubt whispered in his ear, "You're too old, you're too slow, you'll fail them." George turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He drove toward Devil's Bend with the gas pedal pressed to the floor, the speedometer climbing past limits he normally respected. Through his windshield, the Montana sky burned orange and gold with the setting sun. Beautiful and indifferent. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound he had spent a lifetime listening for, the whistle of a train. It sounded like a countdown, like a promise, like a prayer that someone, anyone, would be there to answer when it mattered most. What you're about to hear is the story of George Mitchell, a man who proved that retirement doesn't mean the end of purpose, and that 60 years of life can hold more strength than any number of youthful muscles. This is a story about courage that comes not from fearlessness, but from the knowledge that some moments demand everything we have, no matter the cost. It's a reminder that heroes aren't born. They're forged through years of experience, through loss and love, through the quiet decision to stand up when others cannot. Before we begin, if stories like this inspire you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These are the stories that need to be told, the ones that remind us what truly matters. And if George's courage moves you, give this video a thumbs up to help us share it with others who need this reminder. Real heroism exists. It walks among us. Sometimes it wears reading glasses and has arthritis in its hands. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling us what country and city you're watching from today. Are you in Texas, California, maybe somewhere across the ocean in Europe or Asia? Let us know. It's incredible to see how stories of courage connect people from every corner of the world, reminding us that bravery speaks a universal language. George Mitchell spent 35 years as a train engineer in Montana, navigating some of the most dangerous mountain passes in North America. He had seen derailments, equipment failures, and near misses that would have broken lesser men. But he had also seen the faces of passengers when they arrived safely at their destinations, the relief, the gratitude, the simple joy of being alive. Those faces stayed with him through retirement, through the loss of his wife Ellen, through the long, quiet days when he wondered if his life had made any real difference. On this particular Tuesday, George would get his answer. Because sometimes life gives us one more chance to prove what we're made of, one final test that defines everything that came before. For George Mitchell, that test would come at a place called Devil's Bend, where a malfunctioning switch and a speeding train would force him to choose between the safety of his comfortable retirement and the lives of 187 strangers who were counting on him whether they knew it or not. George's truck tore down Highway 89, the engine screaming in protest as he pushed it past 80 miles per hour. The road curved through pine forests and open meadows, a landscape he normally appreciated for its quiet beauty. Today, it was just an obstacle between him and Devil's Bend. His phone sat in the cup holder, Tommy Chen's voice crackling through the speaker with updates that grew more desperate with each passing minute. The Northern Star was maintaining speed, unaware of the danger ahead. The engineer had been notified, but stopping a fully loaded passenger train required miles of track. They didn't have miles, they had minutes. George's mind catalogued everything he knew about the Devil's Bend switching mechanism. It was an old, mechanical system installed in 1987, the kind that required manual operation when the electrical components failed. Most modern engineers had never seen one, much less knew how to repair it in an emergency. The switch consisted of massive steel rails that could be moved to guide trains onto different tracks. When functioning properly, it was controlled remotely from the dispatch center. When it malfunctioned, someone had to physically throw the switch using a manual lever located inside a narrow maintenance tunnel beneath the tracks. The maintenance tunnel. George felt his stomach tighten. He'd been inside it dozens of times over the years, always during scheduled maintenance, when there were no trains approaching, when time wasn't a factor. The space was barely wide enough for a man to fit through, with sharp metal edges and exposed machinery that could crush fingers or worse. And it required strength, real physical strength, to move the lever when the electrical assist was offline. Strength that his 60-year-old body, ravaged by arthritis and age, might no longer possess. His daughter Sarah's face appeared in his mind, her expression from their last video call 3 days ago. She had begged him to visit, to spend Thanksgiving with her and her husband in Seattle. George had declined, citing the weather, the travel, the usual excuses. The truth was simpler and more painful. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want his daughter to see how much he had slowed down, how his hands shook when he tried to open jars, how he needed reading glasses for everything now. Pride, that dangerous companion of aging men, had kept him isolated in his Montana home. But pride couldn't save 187 lives. Only action could do that. George pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the mountains blur past his windows. He thought about Ellen, his wife of 32 years, who had died in his arms after a 2-year battle with cancer. In those final moments, she had gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered words he had never forgotten. "Promise me you'll keep living, George. Really living, not just existing." He had promised, though he wasn't sure he had kept that promise. Retirement had felt more like waiting than living. The radio crackled again. Tommy's voice was raw with stress. "George, the young engineers tried to access the tunnel. They couldn't figure out how to unlock the access panel. They're panicking. We need you there. Now." George allowed himself a grim smile. The access panel was designed to be difficult, a safety feature to prevent unauthorized access. You needed to know the specific sequence of releases, a detail that wasn't in any manual because the railroad company had lost the documentation decades ago. George knew the sequence because he had opened that panel hundreds of times until it became muscle memory. Devil's Bend appeared ahead, a section of track where the rails curved sharply around a granite outcropping. George could see the small switching station, a weathered building that housed the controls. 3 figures stood outside, young men in railroad uniforms, their body language screaming helplessness. George recognized the posture. He had seen it before in rookie engineers facing their first real crisis. Knowledge without experience was just theory. Experience without courage was just history. But knowledge plus experience plus courage, that combination could move mountains. Or in this case, switch tracks. He skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust, his truck's tires leaving black marks on the gravel. The 3 young engineers turned toward him, their faces a mixture of hope and doubt. George climbed out of the truck, feeling every one of his 60 years in his protesting joints. The tallest of the 3 engineers stepped forward, introducing himself as Marcus Webb. His voice cracked with tension. "Are you George Mitchell? Can you really fix this? The switch is completely frozen. We've tried everything." George didn't waste time with reassurances. He walked straight to the access panel, a rusted metal plate set into the concrete foundation of the switching mechanism. His fingers, twisted with arthritis, found the first release catch by memory rather than sight. Press, slide, twist. The sequence came back to him like a song he hadn't heard in years. The panel swung open, revealing the dark mouth of the maintenance tunnel. The smell hit him immediately: oil, rust, and damp earth. It smelled like every dangerous place he had ever crawled into during his career. One of the young engineers, a woman named Jessica Park, appeared at his side with a flashlight. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly. George checked his watch. 31 minutes. Then he looked at the tunnel entrance, calculating the time it would take to crawl through, diagnose the problem, and manually throw the switch. He looked back at Jessica and gave her the truth. Long enough. Maybe. Probably. We're about to find out. George knelt beside the tunnel entrance, his knees screaming in protest. He took the flashlight from Jessica and pointed it into the darkness. The beam illuminated a narrow passage lined with machinery, pipes, and cables. At the far end, barely visible, was the manual switching lever. Between here and there was 20 feet of tight crawl space that suddenly looked like 20 miles. George took a deep breath, offered a silent apology to his protesting body, and began to lower himself into the tunnel. Behind him he heard Marcus Webb's voice, uncertain and young. "Sir, maybe one of us should go instead." "You're—" George cut him off without turning around. "I'm what? Old, slow, past my prime. All true. But I'm also the only one here who knows how this system works. So unless you've got a time machine, I'm your best option. Now, radio the Northern Star. Tell them to slow down as much as possible without stopping. Every second counts." Then he descended into the darkness, leaving the sunlight and the 3 frightened engineers behind. The tunnel swallowed him whole, and George Mitchell did what he had always done. He moved forward, 1 painful inch at a time, toward a lever that would decide whether 187 people lived or died. The tunnel was worse than George remembered. Years of neglect had allowed rust and corrosion to narrow the already tight space. Sharp edges of metal caught at his jacket as he crawled forward on his hands and knees, the flashlight clenched between his teeth. The beam bounced with each movement, creating a disorienting dance of shadows. His breathing echoed in the confined space, loud and ragged. Above him, the weight of the entire switching mechanism pressed down, tons of steel and machinery that could crush him if anything shifted. His right knee hit something hard, sending a spike of pain up his leg that made him gasp. The flashlight fell from his mouth, clattering against the metal floor and rolling away. Darkness swallowed him completely. George froze, forcing himself to breathe slowly despite the panic clawing at his chest. The blackness was absolute, suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat, too fast, too irregular. His doctor's words from his last checkup echoed in his memory. Your blood pressure is concerning, George. You need to avoid high-stress situations. George almost laughed at the absurdity. He fumbled in the darkness, his arthritic fingers searching for the flashlight. His hand closed around it, and he pressed the button. Nothing. He shook it, pressed again. A weak flicker, then steady light. The beam revealed he had traveled maybe 8 feet, 12 more to go. He checked his watch, though reading it required tilting his wrist at an awkward angle to see through his reading glasses. 27 minutes. The radio on his belt crackled. George, this is Tommy. The Northern Star has reduced speed to 40 miles per hour, but they can't go slower without risking a stall on the grade. You need to move faster. George didn't bother responding. Tommy knew as well as he did that faster wasn't an option in a space where he could barely turn his head. He continued crawling, each forward movement and negotiation with his protesting body. His hands ached, his shoulders burned, and his knees felt like they were being ground between millstones. Then he saw it, the source of the malfunction. A hydraulic line had burst, spraying fluid across the switching mechanism and causing the electrical components to short-circuit. The manual override lever was visible now, just 6 feet ahead, but it was coated in hydraulic fluid and surrounded by sparking wires. George assessed the situation with the calm born of 3 decades of emergency repairs. He would need to disconnect the electrical system first, then clean the lever enough to grip it, then apply enough force to move it despite the seized hydraulic assist. Simple in theory, nearly impossible in practice, especially for a 60-year-old man wedged in a tunnel with limited mobility and even more limited time. George crawled closer, carefully avoiding the sparking wires. His hand reached for the electrical disconnect, a red switch located on the left side of the mechanism. His fingers, twisted with arthritis, struggled to grip it. He tried once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt sent fresh pain shooting through his joints. The switch wouldn't budge. George closed his eyes, remembering Ellen's hands in his during those final hospital days. Her grip had been so weak, but she had held on with everything she had. If she could face death with courage, he could face a stuck switch with determination. He wrapped both hands around the disconnect, ignoring the way his fingers screamed in protest, and pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed. The switch moved. A 1/4 inch. Half. Then with a metallic click that echoed through the tunnel, it gave way. The sparking stopped, the electrical hum died. Now the system was purely mechanical. George shifted his position, trying to get better leverage on the manual override lever. The space was so tight that he couldn't get his shoulders squared. He would have to pull from an awkward angle, using muscles he rarely engaged. His physical therapist's warnings about his rotator cuff injury seemed laughably distant now. He gripped the lever, feeling the hydraulic fluid slick against his palms. This was the moment. Success or failure balanced on his ability to move a piece of steel that weighed more than he did. He pulled. Nothing. The lever didn't even tremble. George repositioned, braced his feet against a support beam, and tried again. This time he felt movement, tiny but real. The lever shifted perhaps 1/8 of an inch. Progress. Painful, incremental progress. His shoulders screamed. His hands felt like they were being crushed. But the lever moved another fraction, then another. George found a rhythm, pulling in short, controlled bursts rather than one sustained effort. Each small victory brought the switch closer to the position that would save 187 lives. The radio crackled again. "George, the Northern Star is 18 minutes out." Jessica's voice this time, steadier than Marcus's but underlaid with fear. "We can see it now. It's coming around the bend." George grunted acknowledgement but didn't stop pulling. The lever was halfway now. Not enough. The switch wouldn't complete its movement until the lever reached the full extension, a mechanical safety feature designed to prevent partial switches that could derail trains. Halfway was the same as failure. His vision began to blur at the edges. George realized with distant alarm that he was hyperventilating, his breathing too fast and shallow in the confined space. The air felt thick, used up. He forced himself to slow down, to breathe deeply despite his racing heart. His body wanted to panic, wanted to give up, wanted to acknowledge that this task was beyond what he could physically accomplish. But George had learned long ago that the body could be overruled by the will. Pain was temporary, regret was forever. He thought of his daughter Sarah, imagined her receiving a call that her father had died trying to save strangers. Would she be proud? Or would she be angry that he had thrown away what remained of his life? Then George thought of the 187 people on that train, each one someone's daughter or son, someone's parent or spouse, each one carrying the same hopes and fears and dreams that made life precious. They didn't know George Mitchell. They would never know how close they came to death, and that was fine. Heroes didn't need recognition. They just needed to act. George pulled again, pouring everything he had left into the effort. The lever moved, 6 inches from full extension. 5, 4. His hands were bleeding now, the hydraulic fluid mixing with blood from torn skin. 3 inches. 2. The metal groaned, resisting with the stubbornness of seized machinery. 1 inch. George's vision went white with pain. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the lever locked into place. The switching mechanism above him shuddered and began to move, tons of steel sliding along ancient tracks, guiding the rails into their new configuration. The eastern track, the one that led to death, was now closed. The western track, the one that led to safety, was open. George collapsed against the tunnel floor, his chest heaving. Every muscle in his body trembled with exhaustion. His hands were a mess of torn skin and blood. But he felt nothing except a distant throb. Shock, probably. Or maybe just the body's mercy when pain becomes too much to process. Above him, the switching mechanism completed its movement with a series of mechanical clicks and thuds. The sound was beautiful. A symphony of functioning machinery that meant the track was now properly aligned. He lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The radio crackled with voices, excited and overlapping. The switch moved. The track is clear. George, you did it. But George couldn't respond. He had nothing left to give, not even words. The tunnel pressed down on him, the darkness complete now that his flashlight had finally died. He was alone in the black, his body broken, his mission accomplished. It would be so easy to just close his eyes and rest. Then he heard it. Faint at first, then growing louder. The whistle of the Northern Star. The sound penetrated the tunnel, vibrating through the steel and concrete. George felt it in his bones. That distinctive call that had been the soundtrack of his entire adult life. He had heard that whistle thousands of times, always from the engineer's seat, always in control. Now he heard it as a passenger would hear it, as a promise of arrival. The train was coming. His work was done. But he was still in the tunnel, and the vibrations of a passing train in such a confined space could be dangerous. George forced himself to move. His arms didn't want to cooperate. His legs felt like dead weight, but he began the agonizing crawl back toward the entrance. Each movement was a small war against his body's desperate desire to surrender. He couldn't see where he was going, couldn't remember how far he had come. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly. His bloodied hand slipped on the metal floor. His knee struck something sharp again, and this time he didn't have the strength to hold back a cry of pain. The whistle sounded again, closer now. George imagined the train approaching Devil's Bend, the engineer watching the track ahead, unaware of how close he had come to catastrophe. 187 people reading books, sleeping, talking, living their lives in blissful ignorance. A young mother holding her baby, an elderly couple holding hands, a businessman reviewing documents, a little girl traveling alone, maybe scared, maybe brave, definitely trusting that the adults in charge knew what they were doing. All of them alive, because a 60-year-old man with arthritis and bad knees had crawled through a tunnel and pulled a lever. Light appeared ahead. Not much, just a grey rectangle that marked the tunnel entrance. George crawled toward it, like a drowning man swimming toward the surface. The whistle sounded a third time, and now he could feel the vibration through the ground. The train was at Devil's Bend, the moment of truth. Either the switch would hold and the Northern Star would smoothly transition to the Western track, or something would fail, and all of George's effort would mean nothing. He reached the entrance, and strong hands grabbed his arms, pulling him out into the fading daylight. Marcus and Jessica hauled him clear of the tunnel and laid him on the grass beside the switching station. George's vision swam, faces appearing and disappearing in his field of view. Someone was talking to him, but the words didn't make sense. Then the ground began to shake, a deep rumble that built to a roar. The Northern Star was here. George turned his head, and through blurred vision he saw it. The massive locomotive, pulling its long chain of passenger cars, approaching the switch at 40 miles per hour. The engineer had his hand on the whistle, sounding it once more as they entered the curve. George held his breath. The lead wheels reached the switch point. There was a brief metallic screech as steel met steel. Then the train flowed smoothly onto the western track, following the curve away from the ravine, away from death, toward continued life. The sound of the train passing was like thunder, each car clicking over the switch point with mechanical precision. George counted them. 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, 20. Passenger cars filled with people who would never know how close they had come. The dining car, the observation car. More passenger cars. The sound began to fade as the train pulled away, continuing its journey south toward destinations that would welcome arrivals instead of mourning losses. Silence settled over Devil's Bend. George lay on the grass, staring up at the Montana sky as it shifted from gold to purple with the approaching dusk. His hands throbbed. His entire body felt like one massive bruise, but he was alive. They were all alive. Jessica appeared in his vision, her face concerned. "An ambulance is on the way," she said. "You need medical attention. Your hands." George tried to wave her off, but found he couldn't lift his arms. "Okay," he managed to whisper. "Okay." Marcus knelt beside him, and George saw tears on the young engineer's face. "You saved them," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "All of them. We couldn't have done it. We didn't know how. But you—" George cut him off with a slight shake of his head. "You would have figured it out," he said, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Or someone else would have come. The important thing is, they're safe. That's all that matters." Marcus nodded, but George could see the young man didn't quite believe him. Sometimes youth needed to believe in heroes. George was too tired to argue. The distant wail of an ambulance siren drifted across the landscape. Help was coming. George closed his eyes just for a moment, just to rest. He thought of Ellen, wondered if she could see him now, if she would approve of how he had kept his promise to keep living. Really living, not just existing. He had found his purpose again, here in this moment, in this place. It hadn't been comfortable. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and necessity, George had learned, was the truest measure of a life well lived. The hospital room was too bright, too clean, too quiet after the chaos of Devil's Bend. George woke to find his hands wrapped in white bandages that made them look like oversized mittens. His daughter Sarah sat in the chair beside his bed, her eyes red from crying. When she saw him open his eyes, she stood so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking on the single syllable. "You stubborn, heroic, impossible man." George tried to smile, but his face felt stiff, disconnected from his intentions. The doctors had sedated him heavily after he arrived at the hospital. His blood pressure had been dangerously elevated, his heart rhythm irregular, and his hands required extensive treatment for lacerations and severe bruising. They had kept him overnight for observation, worried about delayed shock or cardiac complications. George had vague memories of the ambulance ride, of paramedics asking him questions he couldn't quite answer, of pain medication flowing into his veins like liquid relief. But mostly, he remembered the sound of the Northern Star's wheels clicking safely over the switch point. Sarah pulled her chair closer and took his bandaged hand gently in hers. "Tommy Chen called me last night," she said. "Told me what you did. Dad, you could have died in that tunnel. Your heart, your age." She stopped, unable to continue. George watched tears slide down her cheeks and felt his own eyes burn. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know you worry. But there were 187 people on that train. I couldn't not try." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. I just wish you didn't have to be that person alone." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with years of unspoken concerns. George had been alone since Ellen died, by choice, by habit, by the stubborn pride that told him he didn't need help. But lying in this hospital bed, his body broken from an effort that had pushed him past every reasonable limit, he realized something important. Being capable of handling things alone didn't mean he had to. Strength wasn't about isolation. Real strength was about knowing when to accept support, when to let others share the burden. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A nurse entered, followed by 3 people George recognized immediately: Marcus, Jessica, and the third young engineer, a quiet man named David Torres, who hadn't spoken much at Devil's Bend. They looked uncomfortable in the sterile hospital environment, clutching flowers and a card that Marcus held like a shield. "We don't want to intrude," Jessica said quickly. "We just wanted to thank you, to see that you're okay." George gestured them in with a slight movement of his bandaged hand. "Come in, please." The 3 engineers approached cautiously, arranging themselves at the foot of his bed. Marcus handed the card to Sarah, who opened it and began reading silently, fresh tears forming in her eyes. George looked at the 3 young people who had stood helpless at Devil's Bend, and he saw himself at their age, confident in theory, uncertain in practice, desperate for someone to show them how experience translated into action. "We've been with the railroad for 2 years, Marcus said, his words coming in a rush. "They trained us on the modern systems, the computer controls, the automated switches. Nobody taught us the old mechanical systems. Nobody thought we'd ever need to know. When the switch failed yesterday, we didn't even know where to start. If you hadn't come," George interrupted him gently, "but I did come, and now you know. Next time something fails, you'll remember how to access that tunnel, how to disconnect the electrical system, how to operate the manual override. Experience is just knowledge plus memory. Now you have both." Jessica stepped forward, and George noticed she was holding something. "It's a photograph," she said, offering it to Sarah since George's hands were unusable. "We contacted the railroad company. They gave us access to the passenger manifest and helped us reach out to some of the people on the Northern Star. When we told them what happened, what you did, they wanted you to have this." Sarah held up the photograph where George could see it. The image showed a group of people standing beside the Northern Star, which had been stopped at the next station after Devil's Bend. There were easily 50 people in the photo, maybe more, representing every age and background. Front and center stood a young woman holding a baby, both smiling at the camera. Beside her was an elderly couple, their hands clasped together, a businessman in a suit, a group of college students. And in the very front, kneeling down to be at camera level, was a little girl who looked about 8 years old. She had dark hair in pigtails and wore a backpack covered in cartoon characters. She was holding a sign. Sarah's voice trembled as she read the words written on the sign in a child's careful handwriting. "Thank you for saving my life." "Her name is Emma Rodriguez," Jessica said quietly. "She was traveling alone to visit her mother, who's in the hospital in Billings. She's 8 years old. When we told her and the other passengers what happened, she insisted on making that sign. She said she wanted you to know that she's going to remember you forever." George stared at the photograph, at Emma's gap-toothed smile and determined expression. Something broke open in his chest, not painful but releasing, like a dam giving way to let water flow freely. He thought of all the people he had transported safely over his 35 years as an engineer, all the faces he had never seen, all the lives he had touched without knowing. And now he saw them. 187 of them, represented by this group standing beside the train, alive and grateful. "Thank you for bringing this," George managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. The three young engineers nodded, and Marcus cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said. "The railroad company wants to honor you. They're talking about a ceremony, maybe a commendation." George shook his head immediately. "No ceremony. No commendation. I don't want recognition. I just want—" He paused, trying to articulate what he actually wanted. "I just want the railroad to invest in proper training for the old systems. I want you three and every other young engineer to know how to handle the equipment when technology fails. That's the real legacy, not a plaque on a wall." Jessica smiled, and George saw respect in her expression. "We already started," she said. "Yesterday afternoon, after you were taken to the hospital, we spent 4 hours documenting everything about that switch. Marcus took photographs. David made diagrams. I wrote down every step of the process you used. We're putting together a training manual for the old mechanical systems, and we're going to make sure every engineer in Montana knows how to use them." George felt something loosen in his chest. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." The young engineers stayed for another few minutes, sharing details about the improved safety protocols the railroad was implementing, about the inspection of every old switch in the system. When they finally left, promising to visit again soon, George felt exhausted but satisfied. Sarah returned to her chair and took his hand again. "The doctor says you can leave tomorrow if your vitals stay stable," she said. "I've already made arrangements. You're coming home with me to Seattle, for Thanksgiving at least. No arguments." George looked at his daughter, at the fierce love and determination in her face, and realized he didn't want to argue. For 3 years he had isolated himself, convinced that independence meant strength. But maybe strength was also knowing when to accept help, when to let family be family. "Okay," he said, and Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? Just like that? You're not going to fight me on this?" George smiled, and this time his face cooperated. "I'm too tired to fight," he admitted. "And besides, I think I could use some company. It's been too quiet." Sarah leaned forward and kissed his forehead, and George felt the ache of lost years, of time wasted in lonely pride. But he also felt hope, fragile and new, that maybe it wasn't too late to reconnect, to be part of a family again, instead of just a memory of who he used to be. The photograph of Emma Rodriguez and the other passengers lay on his bedside table, a reminder that actions mattered, that one person could make a difference, that age was just a number when courage was required. George closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to truly rest, knowing that when he woke his daughter would still be there. And that was enough. 3 weeks later, George stood in Sarah's kitchen in Seattle, his hands still slightly stiff, but healing well. The bandages were gone, replaced by pink scar tissue that the doctors said would fade with time. His daughter moved around him with practiced efficiency, preparing a Thanksgiving feast that filled the house with the smells of his childhood: roasted turkey, sage stuffing, pumpkin pie. George's son-in-law, Mark, was in the living room, setting up extra chairs for the guests who would arrive soon. It was strange being in someone else's home, strange surrendering control, but also strangely comforting. Sarah handed him a bowl of green beans and a peeler. "You can still handle this, right?" she asked with a gentle smile. George took the peeler, testing his grip. The arthritis was the same as always, the pain familiar. But his hands worked. Slowly, carefully, he began preparing the vegetables. It felt good to be useful, to contribute something even if it was just peeling green beans. For 3 years, he had done everything alone, convinced that accepting help meant admitting weakness. Now he understood that sharing tasks, sharing life, was actually a form of strength. The doorbell rang and George heard Mark greeting someone at the door. Voices drifted into the kitchen, excited and warm. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and touched George's shoulder. "There's someone here who wanted to meet you," she said, her voice carrying a note of anticipation. George set down the peeler and followed his daughter to the living room, wondering who could possibly want to meet a retired train engineer on Thanksgiving. A woman stood in the entryway, holding the hand of a little girl with dark hair in pigtails. George recognized her immediately from the photograph, Emma Rodriguez, the 8-year-old who had been traveling alone on the Northern Star. The woman, presumably Emma's mother, looked thin and tired, but her smile was genuine. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, stepping forward, "I'm Maria Rodriguez. This is my daughter Emma. We wanted to thank you in person. I hope it's okay that we came. Sarah invited us." George looked at his daughter, who shrugged with a pleased expression. "They flew in from Billings yesterday," she said. "I thought you should meet the people you saved, not just see them in a photograph." George turned back to Maria and Emma, suddenly aware of how ordinary he must look, an old man in a cardigan, peeling vegetables in his daughter's kitchen. Not the hero from their story, just a person. "I'm glad you're both safe," he managed to say. "That's what matters." Emma stepped forward, releasing her mother's hand. She looked up at George with serious brown eyes. "My mom was really sick," she said in the clear, matter-of-fact way children have. "I was going to visit her in the hospital. If the train had crashed, I wouldn't have gotten to see her, and she might have died without me there." George knelt down, ignoring the protest from his knees, until he was at Emma's eye level. "But the train didn't crash," he said gently. "Your mum got better, and you got to be with her. That's how the story ends." Emma nodded, then suddenly threw her arms around George's neck, hugging him with the fierce intensity only children possess. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for being brave." George's eyes burned as he returned the hug. This little girl who represented all 187 lives he had saved. When Emma pulled back, she reached into her pocket and handed him something, a drawing on folded construction paper. "I made this for you," she said. George unfolded the paper carefully. The drawing showed a train on tracks, colored in bright crayons. Above the train, Emma had drawn a figure, a man with grey hair and glasses, standing with his arms outstretched. Below the drawing, in careful letters, she had written, "My hero is George Mitchell. He saved my life." George stared at the drawing, unable to speak. It was the most precious thing anyone had ever given him. Maria stepped forward, her own eyes glistening. "The doctors say I'm in remission now," she said quietly. "It's been a hard year, but we're going to be okay. If you hadn't been there at Devil's Bend, Emma would have been orphaned. I would have died, never knowing what happened to my baby. You gave us our future back, Mr. Mitchell. How do you thank someone for that?" George shook his head, finding his voice. "You just did," he said. "Being here, showing me you're both okay. That's all the thanks I need." Sarah invited Maria and Emma to stay for dinner, and they accepted gratefully. As the afternoon progressed, more people arrived. Mark's parents, some neighbors, friends George had never met. The house filled with laughter and conversation, the kind of warm chaos that happens when people gather to share food and gratitude. George found himself telling stories about his years on the railroad, stories he hadn't shared in years because there had been no one to tell them to. Emma sat beside him through dinner, occasionally touching his arm, as if to verify he was real. George found himself telling her about Ellen, about how his wife had supported him through 3 decades of dangerous work, how she had been the strongest person he knew. Emma listened with the rapt attention of childhood, and when George mentioned that Ellen had died, she reached over and patted his hand. "That's sad," she said simply, "but I think she would be proud of what you did." George smiled through sudden tears. "I think so too," he replied. After dinner, as Sarah and Maria cleaned up in the kitchen, George found himself on the back porch with Emma and Mark. The Seattle skyline glittered in the distance, lights beginning to appear as evening approached. Emma pointed at the sky, where the first stars were becoming visible. "My teacher says that when people die, they become stars," she said. "Do you think that's true?" George looked up at the emerging constellations, thinking of Ellen, of all the people he had known and lost over 60 years of living. "I think people become memories," he said finally, "and memories live in here." He pointed to his chest, over his heart. "That's better than stars, because you can carry them with you always." Emma considered this seriously, then nodded. "Like how I'll always remember you saving me." George felt his throat tighten. "Exactly like that," he said. Emma smiled, satisfied with the answer, and leaned against his side as they watched the stars appear one by one. Later that night, after Maria and Emma had left with promises to stay in touch, after the other guests had departed, George sat in Sarah's living room with his daughter and son-in-law. The house was quiet again, but it was a good quiet, the satisfied silence that follows meaningful connection. Sarah sat beside him on the couch. "So," she said gently, "what now, Dad? Are you going back to Montana? Back to being alone?" George thought about his empty house, about the quiet mornings and slow walks, about the routine he had built as armor against grief. Then he thought about Emma's drawing, about the young engineers who had documented his knowledge, about the photograph of 187 people who were alive because experience and courage had met necessity at exactly the right moment. He thought about Ellen's voice, her final words. "Promise me you'll keep living, George, really living." "I think," George said slowly, "I'd like to stay here for a while, if that's okay with you. Maybe find an apartment nearby. I could help Marcus and Jessica with their training manual, maybe teach some classes for the railroad on the old systems, and—" he looked at his daughter, seeing her eyes widen with hope. "I'd like to be part of your life again, really part of it. Not just phone calls and excuses." Sarah threw her arms around him, and George held his daughter close, feeling like he had finally found his way home after being lost for far too long. Outside, the Seattle night deepened, stars filling the sky with distant light. Somewhere in Montana, the rails at Devil's Bend sat empty and silent, their story known only to a few. And somewhere in Billings, a little girl was falling asleep clutching a drawing of a train, and a grey-haired man who had shown her that heroes were real, that courage had no age limit, and that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply refuse to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. George Mitchell closed his eyes, surrounded by family, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt truly at peace.